Hi everyone, my name is Daniel Payne and I'm one of the curators at LSE Library, and I'm joined by Gareth Bryant, who is a doctoral student at the Open University. And Gareth has been working with the library over a number of years in relation to his PhD, where he's curated the current exhibition, which is called A Say in the End of the World, Solidarity and Nuclear Defence in the Cold War. So the point of this video today is to find out a bit more from Gareth about how he curated the exhibition and the nature of the relationship with his PhD. So I thought perhaps we'd start by asking if you could explain a bit about the CDA, what it is, how it came about, and how you found out about it.
Yeah, okay, so the CDA, the Collaborative Doctoral Award, is basically it's a form of PhD award where alongside having a main awarding university, you'll also work with another institution of some kind, it could be a policy or charity, or in this case, the LSE Library. And it came to me as a packaged PhD, I suppose they call it, to do something about the anti-nuclear and peace movements, which this exhibition is about. And I hadn't done any work on that previously, but my supervisor at my master's project was active in that field, worked on nuclear history, and suggested it to me because he knew I was thinking about doing a PhD. And so I applied, not really expecting anything, and I think, it was an interesting decision to make, but it's one I'm very happy to have made. And you don't think about how it was going to turn out, how the exhibition was going to turn out, and everything. But I think it's been an interesting process.
Mm. And so you kind of stumbled into this particular specialism, wasn't it? So.
Yeah, absolutely. My master's and previous work had been on a lot of different things. Really, my master's I did on British nationalism during the 1930s, so I haven't really ever had any experience with nuclear history. But it's one of those instances where you stumble into something and it really does become you spend a lot of time working on it. It was obviously modern British history, so there's not that much time I was doing something on the ancient Romans or something, but it was enough of a difference that I had to do a lot of background reading before I started. But at this point now, it's become my thing. I know it intimately.
And so you're now right at the very, very end of the process. It's been 3 years.
Yes, yeah. So I'm just putting the finishing touches on my thesis now.
Yeah. And it's probably a very horrible question, but can you explain what your PhD is about?
Yeah, I normally avoid trying to answer this question, but now I have to. But so basically my thesis is it takes the anti-nuclear movement and uses it as a way of looking at the political processes in Wales during the 1980s. I'm born and raised in Wales, lived there still in Cardiff. And the scope was a lot broader. I was taking Scotland and various other groups, which you can see reflected here. There's a lot more variety, but I think over the process of going through the documents and things, I whittled it down to something that was obviously a lot more closer to home.
And so you began doing, at the beginning of your PhD, you were obviously reading, or you were obviously at the same time you were starting to think about the exhibition as well. So I guess you started to look at, you come to have a look at the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament archives you have here at the library. So I guess you'd find documents, and sometimes that would be something that you might cite in your PhD, or it might be something you might present at the exhibition. Was there differences in how that made you think about a document in a different way, knowing that it would be displayed rather than?
Yeah, definitely. Obviously as I was going along, it was a process of thinking of both. And obviously I started doing my as part of the CDA. I started my research here. It was the first place I researched, as you mentioned, the CND papers are here, which was a good start. But yeah, I think the main difference between what you would include in an exhibition like this, perhaps, and what you might just cite for an academic paper or a PhD is you can get any little bit of detail out of a letter or a boring piece of text document or something. But when trying to curate an exhibition, I think you've got to think about how it's going to grab the viewers of the exhibition. It really needs to be something that's easily understood, I think. So posters and postcards and images tend to do these things more than internal minutes and things like that.
Yeah, it's a big problem with curating exhibitions is you can come up with a really interesting theme, but the documents have to show it. It's pretty fucking not brilliant documents to look at. Just then about the CND archives here, but some of the archives you use. So you can also use other archives, like the National Library of Wales, or other places.
Yeah, actually, there was a surprising amount of documents in the CND papers here that were relevant to Wales. A lot of the CND Cymru, which is the Welsh body for CND during the 80s, a lot of those papers were here rather than in Wales, which I found slightly perplexing, but that was obviously quite handy. But yes, the National Library of Wales. I did early on make a trip to Scotland as well, but I quickly moved away from using that. But other CND papers, I think, are also in the Modern Record Centre in Warwick. But I think, to be honest, on balance, it's mostly been here and the National Library of Wales as well.
Yeah, and I guess fairly early on, I remember you came up with the title quite quickly, which I was always impressed with because I was stressed about thinking of the title. Could you explain a bit about how the title came about? So it's the saying, "The end of the world, solidarity and nuclear defence and equality."
Yeah, well, it's actually, I probably would have stressed about it, but I think when you were asking me fairly early on during the process, I was sat at my desk and I had a bookcase there, and I just happened to glance at it, and there was a book called "A Saying, the End of the World" by I think Roger Ruston. I think was a theologian. It was about the moral arguments and the moral cases for. I haven't really used the book, to be honest. I think I just picked it up as part of my general reading, but I thought the title was a really evocative way to describe what people felt about their attitude towards nuclear protest.
Yeah, it's a really good resonant title, I think. Then moving on to the sections of the exhibition that you curated, I think I'm trying to remember. The first section is called the National Question. Could you explain a bit about what that section is and the kind of items it included?
Yeah, well, this is the one that most reflects my PhD. So what that section essentially does is looks at the three sections look at different motivations people had for being involved, or different reasons, different groups of people that were involved. And this is obviously the nationalist movements in Scotland and Wales, typically Plaid Cymru and the SNP, are both parties that had a long history of pacifism, of religious-based pacifism, and also a general sense of pacifism. But I think what that section reflects is a sense that two nationalists in these smaller nations within the UK, the nuclear state, the British nuclear state, I suppose, was seen as a symbol of Britishness. And to them, these movements, if they were to see themselves as nations in their own right, then they would potentially be ones that would be shrugging off this involvement in the nuclear world that they didn't necessarily see was their own decision. So, I've tried to engage a little bit with that. Again, it's something that I've tried to condense down to perhaps 200 words, which I've written 100,000 on. But yeah, it's an interesting political angle that I don't think gets talked about a lot in the history of the peace movement.
Yeah, I've noticed a few comments from the exhibition actually about people drawing out that they weren't aware of that sort of aspect of it. So it's really good that it's been highlighted. And then the second section, which is about trade unions, could you talk a bit more about that?
Yeah, well, obviously the peace movement and anti-nuclear movements have obviously been quite typically radical and on the left of British politics, and particularly during the 1970s and 80s, I think a lot of the trade unions were occupying that space as well. So there was quite a lot of crossover already, solidarity between the two movements. But one of the interesting things with the trade unions is the way in which some of the unions at least may have had people who were employed in industries allied to nuclear weapons, who maybe were a little bit skeptical about getting rid of nuclear weapons and how it would affect their employment. So the campaigners had to be a little bit clever about this and think about a way of involving essentially converting nuclear and allied industries to peaceful production. And this was a campaign that I think we've got an item over there about jobs on the Clyde in Scotland, obviously where a lot of the nuclear submarines were based along the Clyde. And this is that sense of using those, maintaining the employment, but converting the factories and the institutions to produce things that were socially useful. And this is something that goes back quite a long way in peace, and not just for nuclear weapons, but for all arms in general. I'm sure something that probably the campaign against the arms trade might have campaigned on at some point. But so there was this not just a natural alliance that comes from being kind of radical and on the left, but there were different ways in which people's motivations and actual personal individual needs have to be considered when you're thinking about how to pitch nuclear disarmament to them.
And do you think the trade unions are quite successful in your opinion, kind of reframing that pitching it, or?
Well, I think so. Yeah, it's difficult to tell how individual union members thought about it. Obviously, it will differ massively, I'd imagine, from union to union. Because if you compare perhaps coal miners to, I don't know, people involved in nuclear science, there's probably going to be massive different reasons that you may support or oppose things, and you may be conflicted on the issue. So I'm not entirely sure how. It doesn't appear to be something that was very big within the trade union movement in terms of the amount of effort that was put into it, but there's certainly a lot of literature has been produced, and I think it's something that the campaigners at least wanted to pursue because they knew that you'd have to get the unions and I suppose working class people on the side in order to get these issues.
And so moving on to the final section, which is about Christian solidarity. Can you talk more about that theme and why you chose it?
Well, yeah, so obviously, as I mentioned, with the nationalist movement, there's been a long history of passive involvement in the peace movement from the Christian background. Again, it's something that obviously is woven into Christianity, a belief in peace, or certainly, I suppose, wars having to be just and things like that, and humane. So there's a long-standing tradition, and obviously this goes back to the founding of the CND in the late 1950s. Anne Collins, who was I'm not sure. Yes, that's right. Yeah, Anglican. Yeah, and he was again a massive figure during CND. And then close to this period in the 1980s, there was the Catholic Monsignor Bruce Kent was a big leader, and he led the CND during the second half of the 1980s. And there's always been a strong Christian representation. And we've got a document over there with Bruce Kent actually did a sponsored walk, or a kind of a walk for raising awareness, I suppose, all across Europe. I think it was 1,000 miles, I think it says on there. And across Europe, and that's across the Iron Curtain as well, which during the late 1980s, there was an increased effort to try and build bridges across. And I suppose this also goes along with persecuted Christian people in Eastern Europe as well, and that was perhaps a way of building the bridges. So it's one of a number of different ways in which people's personal identities and personal beliefs can be used and were motivations for being involved in nuclear activism.
And you mentioned Bruce Kent because he also appears in another section of the exhibition from the Women and Families for Defence archives of Olga Matland. I think there's a picture of him being arrested at a protest. I think he, like Pat Harrison as well, they're arrested a lot of times.
Yes.
Yeah, so I guess now we're coming to the end of the exhibition. I wonder if, looking back on it, do you have any thoughts about if there's anything you'd do differently if you were creating another exhibition, or if you had any advice for someone that was creating an exhibition, and particularly about CDA, what do you kind of think about it?
Yeah, well, I don't think there is really anything I would do differently, not off my head anyway. I think, particularly the way it's developed, because I think it began, there was a vague sense that we might get some of the other collections involved, maybe again, but as it developed and we obviously have you just received the campaign against the arms trade, so it seemed sense to have a section for them, and then Kate Hudson approached you about writing for Pat Arrowsmith, so we had a section. Originally, I was going to write a section about women, but I thought, why not have one of the most prominent women in CND write again about one of the other most prominent women from CND. So that was really, really lovely, and I think also one of the most interesting things that came along was when you approached me about Olga Matland's papers, which again, it's not something you traditionally would think about having in something like this. But I think often these sorts of events can tend to be a little bit one-sided. And because a lot of the people involved tend to be sympathetic, at least to the causes you're looking at, it can be a little bit one-sided. And I think it's nice to have balance, even if people may disagree with one side or the other. I think obviously Olga was very forthright in her views, and that's great. And it's good to have people represented here, and it not be, as a historian, I think public history should be as balanced as possible. In terms of advice for somebody who's maybe curating an exhibition for a start, I would say what we touched on earlier on, trying to condense what you're trying to say into a very easily digestible package, because I think I was obviously coming at it from quite a well-researched background and all these different papers and documents that I discovered, and I had to be very concise and bring those down to maybe 6 documents per section and write maybe 200, 250 words. and it's not easy, but that's something you have to do. Or if you can't, there's not enough room to write reading text or anything like that. You have to make sure the text is very concise and gets your message across without waffling, and I suppose leaves people to think themselves about what they're being shown rather than telling them what to think.
Okay, so I think we're coming toward the end of our chat. Was there anything else that you wanted to say about the experience and share about the exhibition?
We've covered most of the actual process, I suppose, of the exhibition. But one of the interesting things that was kind of almost a surprise and came quite organically really was this poster that we had designed. It was designed by an artist, Dara Slattery, and that was really interesting because I think we had a little bit of money left in the budget. But well, how can we use this creatively? And I mean, it is a gorgeous poster. And I met with Sarah, spoke for about an hour, I think, on Teams, whatever, and she just asked me sort of about my thesis and about the themes and about kind of the imagery that I've associated with it. And we've got all sorts of things. Obviously, the Welsh theme of my thesis is heavily represented with the dragon clutching the bomb here, but we've got things like the industry and miners and peace and things like this. I think it's a really gorgeous representation of what's involved. And again, I'm thinking about visually how these things are represented. Talking about that earlier on, I think this is a really great example.
Yeah, I think she did a really good job. And I hope it lives beyond the exhibition in some form with your brother.
Yes, an interesting idea.
Cool. Well, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you for having me.